The lively classroom fell into an uneasy silence as the scathing remarks aimed at Donald Trump echoed across the room. Every gaze turned toward Barron Trump, who sat quietly, his expression unreadable. But then, unexpectedly, he raised his hand, shattering the tension in the air. What came next? How did a young man transform ridicule into a profound moment of reflection that left the entire lecture hall contemplating? Stay tuned to discover this powerful and emotional story of understanding. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring tales like this one. The lecture hall at NYU Stern buzzed with activity. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor, and the faint clicking of laptop keys filled the air as students prepared for a spirited discussion on economics. Professor Parker, known for her blunt demeanor and unforgiving critiques, wasted no time diving into the day's topic, ethics in business. Her voice carried across the room with commanding authority, captivating the attention of every student. The lecture began with an analysis of weak leadership and corporate greed before taking an unexpectedly personal turn. "Let's talk about Donald Trump," she announced, a sly smile creeping across her face. A self-proclaimed billionaire with business ethics as questionable as his hairstyle. Awkward laughter rippled through the room, but it quickly dissipated as she pressed on, criticizing Trump's real estate ventures and branding them as exaggerated failures. She described his leadership style as the epitome of narcissism. The tension in the room was palpable. A few students exchanged uneasy glances, while others stifled nervous chuckles. In the front row, Barron Trump sat silently. His face remained calm, betraying no emotion except for a subtle tightening of his jaw and a fleeting glance at his notebook, small signs that the professor's words had not gone unnoticed. As Professor Parker continued, a faint murmur spread among the students, reflecting their discomfort. Everyone knew who the young man in the front row was, yet no one dared to meet his gaze. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, anticipating what might come next. Perhaps emboldened by Barron's silence, Professor Parker raised her voice further. "And let's not forget The Art of the Deal," she said, dripping with sarcasm. "A book that teaches you how to overpromise and underdeliver." She dissected one of Trump's controversial business decisions, a high-profile project that had ended in bankruptcy. With each pointed critique, she detailed the missteps, concluding, "This is precisely what not to do if you aim for long-term success." Her final remark landed with a sharp thud, punctuated by the dramatic tap of her pen on the lectern. The room grew heavier with silence. The scattered laughter from earlier had vanished, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Some students fidgeted in their seats, sneaking glances at Barron. They seemed unsure whether to admire his composure or feel embarrassed on his behalf. A few shifted away subtly, as if trying to distance themselves from the mounting tension. Barron remained seated, his hand resting on his notebook. His expression was unreadable, but subtle cues, slightly clenched fingers, a brief tightening of his lips, hinted at the effort it took to maintain his composure. His eyes stayed fixed on the professor, analyzing every word with quiet intensity. Sensing no resistance, Professor Parker pushed further. "The remarkable thing," she declared, "is how someone can fail so spectacularly yet still market themselves as a genius. It's proof that branding often trumps reality." The silence in the room became so profound that the ticking of the wall clock echoed sharply. Students stole glances at Barron, curious whether he would respond. Some silently hoped he'd remain quiet, while others seemed eager for him to speak. And then it happened. Barron shifted slightly in his seat, raising his hand with deliberate calm. The small gesture shattered the stifling tension. Every eye in the room turned toward him, and the hall collectively held its breath. Even Professor Parker paused mid-sentence, visibly taken aback. "Yes?" she asked, her tone cautious but tinged with surprise. Barron took a moment before speaking, his composure measured and steady. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the desk. "There's something I'd like to share if I may." His voice was calm, yet carried a quiet determination that was impossible to ignore. Professor Parker nodded, her expression unreadable, as though bracing herself for the unexpected. "My father taught me something different about success," Barron began, his tone resolute. He taught me that behind every achievement is a team of people who made it possible. Success isn't just the story of one person, it's the result of the collective efforts of those who believe in a vision, even when the odds seem insurmountable. His gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of his peers before returning to Professor Parker. That's something I've witnessed firsthand. Hard work, loyalty, and resilience, those are the values he's instilled in me, and I strive to live by them. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. A few students adjusted their postures, their faces reflecting newfound contemplation. Barron's words resonated not just for their content but for the sincerity with which he delivered them. He wasn't blindly defending his father, he was offering a deeply personal perspective rooted in his own experience and convictions. I understand that public figures like my father are always targets for criticism, Barron Trump began calmly. And they should be. Criticism is part of accountability. But I think there's a difference between constructive critique and turning someone into a scapegoat for everything we perceive as wrong in the world. No one is perfect, and no one achieves success alone. I think it's important to acknowledge both the flaws and strengths of a person, especially when we influence how others perceive them. The room remained utterly silent, the air heavy with a blend of emotions. Barron's words not only challenged Professor Parker but also prompted everyone present to reflect deeply on their own perspectives. Professor Parker's expression shifted subtly, her eyes softening. She placed her marker down on the desk and stepped away from the lectern. "You make a good point," she admitted, her tone quieter now. "Perhaps I've been too harsh in my criticism. It's easy to focus on the negatives, especially when discussing someone as polarizing as your father. But you've reminded me that every story is more than just a headline." Barron gave a small, composed nod. "Thank you for hearing me out," he said evenly. The professor hesitated for a moment, then added, "And thank you for speaking up. That takes a great deal of courage." For the first time that day, light applause began at the back of the room. It wasn't loud or prolonged, but it carried a weight of its own, a silent acknowledgement of Barron's poise and grace. The room still hummed with the emotional resonance of what had just unfolded as Professor Parker returned to the lectern. Her sharp confidence now carried a new undertone, respect. Barron leaned back in his chair, appearing relaxed, though the impact of his words still lingered in the air. Unexpectedly, he raised his hand again. The professor paused, gesturing for him to continue. "I'd like to add one more thing," Barron began, his voice steady but warm. "I'm here as a student, just like everyone else. I came to learn, to grow, and to understand perspectives that differ from my own. And I want to thank you, Professor Parker, for challenging us. It's through discussions like this that we find clarity, even if it's uncomfortable at times." The atmosphere in the room softened. A few students exchanged glances, some offering small smiles or subtle nods. Barron's humility seemed to dissolve the biases and assumptions that had clouded the earlier discussion. The professor's surprise was evident, but her response this time was measured. "You're right," she said thoughtfully. "Discomfort is often the beginning of learning. I hope all of you remember that, not just in this discussion but in life." As she turned back to the whiteboard, the lecture resumed, but the energy in the room had transformed entirely. Students who had been silent and uneasy earlier now began asking questions and engaging in debates with newfound curiosity. Barron participated, though he stepped back to let others lead, observing the discussion as it unfolded. As the class ended and the sound of students packing their belongings filled the air, there was a palpable reluctance to disrupt the rare sense of camaraderie that had developed. Barron stood, gathering his notebook, when a fellow student hesitantly approached. "Hey," she said softly, her voice unsure. "I just wanted to say that what you said earlier really resonated with me. I think a lot of us needed to hear that." Barron offered a polite smile. "Thank you. I think it's important to remember that every story has more sides than what we initially see." More students began to gather around, some voicing their support, others simply nodding in agreement. Barron's calm demeanor and thoughtful words had left an undeniable impression. Even those who didn't speak seemed to carry a newfound respect for him. Outside the lecture hall, Professor Parker stood near the door, watching as students filtered out. When Barron passed her, she gave a slight nod. "Thank you, Barron," she said simply. "For what?" he asked, his expression genuinely curious. "For reminding me that even teachers have a lot to learn." Barron exited the hall, his mind still replaying the discussion. He wasn't one to seek attention, but the quiet acknowledgement from his peers left him reflecting on what had transpired. He paused in the hallway, adjusting his bag on his shoulder. Around him, conversations flowed, but a few students glanced his way, offering nods or brief words of appreciation. "Hey, Barron," a male student called, catching up to him. "What you said back there? That was seriously impressive. Not many people could have handled it the way you did." Barron met the compliment with a modest smile. "Thanks," he said. "I think it's just about staying true to what you believe and remembering that every discussion is an opportunity to learn." Barron Trump shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I just said what I felt needed to be said." The other student chuckled and shook his head. "Still, that takes courage. Anyway, thanks for speaking up." He gave Barron a light pat on the shoulder before disappearing into the bustling crowd. As Barron stepped into the crisp autumn air of the campus courtyard, a sense of relief began to wash over him. The cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves, and he took a deep breath, letting the tension from earlier dissolve. Spotting an empty bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, he made his way over, seeking a moment of quiet amid the campus bustle. Just as he settled into the shaded spot, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from his mother. "I heard about your class today. I'm so proud of you." A warm smile spread across his face as he quickly typed a reply before tucking the phone away. Leaning back, he allowed himself a brief moment of calm, but the sound of approaching footsteps soon drew his attention. Looking up, Barron saw Professor Parker standing a few steps away, a coffee cup and a stack of papers in her hands. Her expression was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Mind if I sit for a bit?" she asked. "Of course," Barron replied, gesturing to the open space beside him on the bench. She sat down, took a sip of her coffee, and broke the silence. "You know, I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I can count on one hand the number of students who've challenged me, respectfully, that is." Barron tilted his head slightly, his gaze calm and steady. "I didn't mean to challenge you, Professor. I just thought the conversation needed a bit more balance." Parker let out a small chuckle, nodding. "And that's exactly what caught my attention. You didn't respond with anger or defensiveness, you spoke with clarity and conviction. That's rare, especially these days." She paused, her eyes drifting to the courtyard where students hurried past. "I wanted to thank you for that. Today, you reminded me of something important. Words carry weight, and it's easy to forget the humanity behind every critique." Barron nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "I think we all need that reminder sometimes, myself included." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the lively hum of campus life carrying on around them. After a moment, Professor Parker turned back to Barron, her voice softer. "You know, standing at a lectern and offering opinions is easy, especially when you're removed from the people those opinions affect. Today, you reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place, to foster real dialogue, not just deliver my own perspective." Barron met her gaze, his eyes reflecting quiet understanding. "I think those conversations are important, even when they're uncomfortable. But it's just as important to listen. That's something my father always taught me. You don't have to agree with everyone, but you should always try to understand where they're coming from." Parker nodded slowly, her eyes returning to the courtyard as she watched the students pass by. "That's good advice," she said. "And for what it's worth, I'll be rethinking how I approach certain topics in the future. Today wasn't just a lesson for the students, it was a lesson for me too." Barron offered a small smile, appreciative of her humility. "Thank you for saying that. It really means a lot to me." Parker stood, adjusting the stack of papers in her arms. "I have to get going, but I want you to know that what you said today, it mattered." "Thank you, Professor," Barron replied, rising to his feet. "And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak." As she walked away, Barron remained seated, watching the flow of students around him. A quiet sense of pride settled over him, not for defending his father, but for how the conversation had shifted from confrontation to mutual understanding. That evening, as Barron prepared for the next day's classes, he received several messages from classmates thanking him for his words. Some admitted they had misjudged him before, seeing him only as the son of a controversial figure. Now, they saw someone thoughtful, composed, and willing to stand firm in his beliefs without demeaning others. For Barron, the day hadn't been about changing minds but planting a seed. As he packed his books, he hoped that seed would grow into something greater, a reminder to seek understanding even in the face of criticism. What would you do in Barron's place? How would you handle criticism in such a public setting? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire others. If you found value in this story, share it to help spread the message of understanding and mutual respect. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.